Great. Okay, well, I should be sharing a copy of the agenda for today's meeting. And just quickly to give a little bit of an overview, I guess, Heather, you're going to call the meeting to order and do a roll call here in a minute. But at any rate, Sean McKiernan and myself are going to walk the work group members through some trends in student outcomes for the public university model. Obviously, the student success metrics include bachelor's degree, student progression, credit hours earned. Back in September of 2022, we sent a performance funding survey out to the campuses and asked them to respond to 3 basic questions of whether or not the model was functioning as expected, were there any unintended consequences, and did they have any recommended adjustments to the model? And then lastly, we're going to finish up with some funding model distribution scenarios, several that have been submitted by an institution and or proposed as a recommended change to the funding model. So we've got about 6 scenarios we're going to share with you. And we're going to try to do that within the first 20 to 25 minutes of this meeting, even though we've got 44 slides. We don't intend to cover every slide in detail because most of the slides are self-explanatory. We're then going to turn it over to Brendan Lehane and Alicia from KCTCS. They're going to share some information about trends in student outcomes for the 2-year funding model, and then also their funding model survey results. And then lastly, we'll circle back around and share some next steps.
Well, guys, it sounds like Bill went ahead and jumped in and gave you my part. So I don't have much to say after that.
We waited for a couple of minutes.
Well,
Thompson and Heather suggested that we go ahead and get going. So blame Heather, please.
Okay, I'll blame Heather. But good, welcome everybody. We're looking forward to this. I'm not sure who's left to show up. I don't see our elected officials on here yet. I do think I see the budget director or the secretary of the cabinet. I thought I saw his face. Oh, there he is. Hey, John, how are you? Yeah, so we can go ahead. Bill, you have done a good job of outlining what we're going to do, so we won't spend any time on me telling you the other things I was going to tell you, but I will as we go throughout the process. So go ahead, Bill, and start the process.
Okay, I should be sharing my screen now. There we go. And this is for the public university section of the program. And as I said a minute ago, we're going to be looking at some trends in student outcomes, and then the funding model survey, and then touch on a few of those funding model scenarios I mentioned just a moment ago. So let's go ahead and kick it off with trends in student outcomes. And as I said a minute ago, I'm not going to go through every slide. I think most of these are self-explanatory. There's 3 main sections: bachelor's degree production, student progression, and credit hours earned. Just to remind you of what the university model metrics include in terms of the student success metrics. You've got total bachelor's degrees, STEM plus H bachelor's degrees, URM and low income bachelor's degrees, student progression at 30 credit hours, 60 credit hours, 90 credit hours, and then lastly, student credit hours earned. You're going to notice that the format in terms of this trends in student outcomes presentation is very similar for each metric. There's going to be a table showing the change between 2014 and 2021, and then the number change and percent change by institution. There's going to be a trend line for the sector for that given metric. And then we're going to compare the 7-year increase or decrease in that metric to the sector average highlighted in yellow. And then lastly, we're going to show a chart that shows the cumulative net gain in a given metric. And what the cumulative net gain is going to do, it's going to take the 2013-14 baseline, and for every year that we have data over that 7-year period following 2013-14 is compared back to that baseline, and we count the number of degrees that are over that baseline If an institution is below that baseline, we deduct how many degrees they're below that baseline. And then we count the cumulative either net gain or net loss over that period. So for every metric, there's going to be 3 charts and 1 table. And let's go ahead and get started with the total bachelor's degrees. As you can see, this table to the left looks at total bachelor's degrees produced over that 7-year time period between 2014 and 2021. 6 out of 8 of our universities actually increased the number of bachelor's degrees produced during that time period. You can see in total, it was an increase of almost 1,300 degrees or 8%. UK, U of L, and Murray all recorded positive number changes over that period, and UK and Murray had the largest percent changes. And so that's what I take away from that table. If you look at the chart on the right, that chart shows the total bachelor's degrees produced, again, over that 8-year time frame. And what you can see after 4 years in a row, the total number of bachelor's degrees produced leveled off starting in 2017-18, and then it actually dipped slightly in 2021. And the compound annual growth rate over that time period is 1.1% per year. Does anybody have any questions about that information?
Yeah, Bill, love to hear just a brief explanation of the last year's drop.
I believe that was the start of sort of the COVID pandemic years. There were a couple of years there where our enrollment had declined, and in fact, enrollment had begun to decline 2 or 3 years prior to the COVID year hitting. And so that might possibly be some students not taking enough courses to finish up in 2021. But it's also a factor of declining enrollment for most of our institutions starting around 2016-17, 2017-18. We've seen, with the exception of maybe UK, we've seen most of our universities have a declining FTE enrollment over that period. And we actually shared a couple of tables and charts at our last meeting showing what was going on with those FTE data.
Hey, John, just to answer you really directly, it's a direct correlation between the two. Our transfer percent may be up, but our transfers are down. We are producing more degrees per population we have lesser population. So this is truly a declining college going rate from those graduating from high school, now 47.8. The pandemic did exacerbate that, to be honest with you. Then we had a lower retention rate at COVID year. Fewer people returned the second year as had been in the past. This year we've seen an uptick, but it's going to take a while to catch up because the uptick it's basically entering freshmen. And so, but that will have an effect on all 4 years. So direct correlation, because the output is in fact still in place. It's the input that's the issue.
Going on to the next slide, this chart on the left shows the 7-year change in bachelor's degrees produced, again, between 2014 and 2021. The sector average is shown in yellow in terms of the yellow bar. And as you can see from this chart, that UK and Murray were the only 2 institutions that had a percent change above that sector average. That is important for every single metric in this performance funding model, because institutions from 1 year to the next that earn at or above, well, not necessarily at, but above that sector average, increase their share of funding from that metric pool. So there's a bachelor's degree funding pool. And from 1 year to the next, if UK and Murray were above that sector average, they would increase their share of funding and thus their distribution from that bachelor's degree pool. As was shown on the previous slide in the table, the largest number changes occurred at UK, U of L, Murray, and Western. And this chart shows you who had the largest percent change over that time period relative to the sector average. If you look at the chart on the right, that cumulative net gain in bachelor's degrees produced, UK, Murray, Western, and U of L produced 85% of that positive net gain over that time period. Now, this chart does not show a net loss of 318 degrees at Kentucky State University, nor is that loss reflected in that positive net gain figure. If it was the total net gain, we would deduct the 318, but in a pie chart, it's hard to show a negative. So that's the positive net gain, 10,490 degrees. And you get a sense of cumulatively which institutions are contributing to that positive net gain. Moving on to STEM plus H bachelor's degrees produced. Again, this is similar to the table you saw with total bachelor's degrees. The institutions that recorded the largest number change over that time period were UK, U of L, and Northern. In terms of percent change, UK and Moorhead had the largest percent change over that 7-year period. If you look at the trend line to the right, it's very evident that we increased, 5 years in a row, the number of STEM degrees produced. But then in 2019-20 and 2020-21, that leveled off and even dipped slightly. However, this is tremendous growth over this time period. If you look at the total number of degrees produced in the table, over 1,400 degree increase, 28% over that 7-year period. That's a compound annual growth rate of 3.5% per year. In terms of a comparison to the sector average for the 7-year change, UK, Moorhead, Northern, and U of L were above that 28% sector average. And then if you look at the cumulative net gain chart, 5 universities, UK, U of L, Eastern, Northern, and Murray produced 90% of the positive net gain for that period. This is another area that we're really proud of. President Thompson, Lee Nemec, Travis Powell, with our diversity policy and other strategic agenda priorities have really been focusing on closing those achievement gaps. We're making great progress in terms of URM bachelor's degree production. If you look at the total in terms of the table on the left, an increase of almost 740 degrees over that time period, 38%. That's unprecedented, folks. That's knocking the ball out of the park. In terms of the institutions that grew most in terms of number, that was UK, U of L, Northern, and Western. And UK and Northern had the largest percent increases, 78% for UK, 66% for Northern. That's tremendous growth over a 7-year time period. Again, 6 years of growth in a row in URM bachelor's degrees. And then in 2021, a slight decrease. But look at that compound annual growth rate, 4.7% per year. We're doing really well in that regard. President Thompson, you want to make any comment?
I do, and I think we'll get to this later. You saw the National Student Clearinghouse came out, and Kentucky is number 2 in the nation in increase in completion. But if we're not number 1, we're close to number 1 in gap closing with our underrepresented populations. So, I mean, this is good news that we get recognized nationally about, and I don't think we talk a lot about it in the state very much. So as we're looking at this performance funding model, I think it would behoove us to understand that elements of this surely working and working well. And this is an example where Kentucky is a national shining star. So I would be remiss if I didn't speak up and make such a statement.
Thank you, President Thompson. Again, this chart on the left shows the 7-year change in terms of minority bachelor's degrees produced relative to the sector average. You can see that 38% sector average highlighted in yellow. UK, Northern, and U of L had percent change over this time period above the average. But look at Moorhead, look at Western, very close to that sector average. So a number of our institutions are doing very well in terms of producing additional minority student degrees. If you look at the cumulative net gain chart on the right, again, 4 universities, UK, U of L, WKU, and NKU accounted for almost 90% of that cumulative net gain. And the reason we use that cumulative net gain, it's somewhat similar to the chart on the left, but the chart on the left only uses 2 data points. It's only comparing 2021 to 2014. By looking at that cumulative net gain, we see which institutions on a year in, year out basis are producing additional degrees above that 2014 baseline. And so we feel like it's important to show that. I'm going to go ahead and just show you what remains in terms of these trends in student outcomes without going through each specific slide. We've got low income bachelor's degrees. We've got student progression at 30 credit hours, at 60 credit hours, at 90 credit hours. And then lastly, student credit hours earned. Again, the format very similar. We've got the table showing that difference between 2014 and 2021, the trend line comparison to the to the sector average, and then that cumulative net gain chart. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sean McKiernan to take us through some of the slides from that performance funding survey that we sent out this past September.
Good afternoon. Back in September, we asked the institutions to send us some summary statements on their experiences with performance funding over the last 6 years. The broad questions we asked them to answer mirror the charge of this work group, mainly to determine in what ways the model is functioning as expected. Are there any unintended consequences that have come about as a result of the model? And are there any adjustments that need to be made to the model that the institutions recommend? And we received these responses, and I'm going to go through the first couple sections very quickly. Most of the institutions indicated that the model was focusing appropriately on student success and aligned well with their goals and with their strategic agendas. If we can keep going, that the model was objective, and Northern pointed out that it was a vast improvement to the previous model, which was basically a base plus or base minus kind of model. WKU noted that the model reflected the values and goals that were included in its strategic plan. So the next section, unintended consequences, Bill and I noted that there's a lot of alignment between this section and the next section. You know, which recommendations did the institutions have? And so I'm going to just jump ahead to the recommended adjustments. University of Kentucky, each institution that responded has a slide. University of Kentucky noted that needed to maintain and increase state support, that was vital for the model to work as intended. And they also requested that distributions from the performance fund be recurring. And that's vital to allow institutions to plan for long-term use of the funds and avoid any perception that the funds can be cut without consequence.
Well, and the other thing, Sean, that it does is by making funds that are earned recurring, it's what actually moves the institutions toward that elusive funding parity, which we have not been able to reach over the past 5 years prior to this year because of a lack of funding the model. We actually got $17+ million last year, an additional $80 million this year. And if the funds that were earned in the current year were to be made recurring to the formula base of the institutions that earned those funds, we would essentially be at funding parity for every university with the exception of Kentucky State University.
UK asked that the inflationary adjustments for mandated programs be included in CPE's budget requests, and noted that the model does not reward research or public service activity. And so that was important for that institution. UK also
but Secretary Hicks has a question, I do believe.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I didn't get a chance to attend the entire meeting last time because of session requirements here, but Bill, I think that was an important point you made that ought to be on one of your slides about this issue of parity, because my interest has longstanding been less about parity and more about performance reward. Right, and I know in the statute we have those two conflicting goals, and they are conflicting. But I've got a question about, I wanted to make a comment because I didn't get a chance to, Dr. Thompson, last time about, talk about, well, what is the purpose other than rewarding performance? What's the purpose of the additional money, right? It's not to put it in the bank. It's to create a greater capacity, however the university seems fit, to contribute further, to these performance outcomes, right? I mean, so that's otherwise, why are we interested in more funding, right? That's the purpose of it. So, I'm an old budget guy, right? I understand this issue about funds not being recurring. And so I think those two statements, I will just say, are in conflict with one another. If the purpose of the additional funding is to improve the capacity of the institutions to achieve performance outcomes, you don't do that very often with one-time money. There are instances in which that can fit, but in the main, I believe that it's the recurring funds that contribute better to the financial capacity of the institution to increase performance. So I can, I've just, I've had discussions with others about this notion. So I just want to say that I'm generally supportive, because that's just, I'll call it basic budgeting principles, basic financial management principles, that if you can count on the funds, then you should be contributing them to the things that help you with performance outcomes. If some of those things are non-recurring, fine, right? But I suggest that the bulk of those are in fact recurring, the needs that the institutions have for more funding. So I just wanted to make that comment, Dr. Thompson, since I didn't get a chance to last meeting.
Secretary Hicks, I really appreciate that, because that was the discussion we had, and we hadn't heard you say that. I'll tell you, funds, for me, as I think about it from a statewide perspective of creating what the state needs for economic development, is to create a continuous improvement process that would allow each of our institutions to contribute based on the mission, direction, vision of that institution to help the state do exactly that. So I guess I'm seconding your statement, because that's exactly right. And, I'll pick on Jay Morgan. I love you, Jay. But if we never give you any money to put in your base, it's going to be hard to keep faculty, and it's going to be hard for you to build this student success process that will create continuous improvement. And so that doesn't mean that there's not going to be some institutions that super outperform others, and that can get to the parity conversation again about where we start. And I know we are not ready for speeches now, I get it, but I guess I just want to go ahead and second your statement, Secretary.
Aaron, this is David, and I do appreciate the notion of parity, and I do think that in this exercise we're going to have to define parity and what are the parameters under which we believe that we have reached a degree of parity, because I'm sure there are many on this call who do not feel that as they're currently funded that the parity exists. And so I think that's an important thing, that before we state that as a fact, that we understand what the definition of that is.
Just continuing with the slides, UK also noted that the productivity adjustment in the bachelor's degree metric, so that's an efficiency metric. It normalizes bachelor's degrees to some extent. UK noted that it negatively impacts institutions with growing enrollment, and so they would recommend that that be phased out or eliminated, that adjustment be eliminated. Next slide, please, Bill. University of Louisville's recommendations include providing additional base funding outside of the model. They noted that it would help their institution and others address mental health needs and attainment gaps. They suggested increasing weightings for URM and low-income students, suggested removing the square footage metric or adjusting it to reflect cost differentials, recommended revising the model so that funding pools are no longer distributed based on productivity relative to the sector average. There was some conversation about only rewarding institutions that have improvement in a certain metric. And so that would be a departure from the current practice that is essentially strictly competitive for each pool. They also talked about excluding mandated programs in some way from the allocable resources, stopping that practice. Bill, next slide. Eastern Kentucky noted that in their opinion, 3 separate models would be more appropriate. So in other words, research institutions, comprehensive institutions, and KCTCS each having their own model, that the model should emphasize rate of improvement over volume. They agree with most of the institutions that the state should continue investing in higher education. They are advocating for a metric that would include students with disabilities explicitly, advocate for eliminating the small school adjustment for research institutions, and want to include a metric that would reward efficiency for square footage or instruction and student services spending. Also advocated for eliminating the research sector weighting for FTE students. And I'm getting through these quickly, but I think it's important to get all of these in. Morehead State asked for a distribution of 1/3 of any new money to the institutions on a proportionate basis. So again, in addition to the base that was outside of the model, asked to remove the sector weighting for all degree metrics, remove the square footage metric from the model in its entirety, noted that the goal of the model should be to equalize total public funds per student and not to achieve parity in state funding, and asked that the model would, to that end, include consideration of net tuition revenue. Next slide. Murray State University asked for a distribution of a portion of available performance funds to the base of each institution, again, outside the model. Use the formula share to distribute remaining performance funds. And so that's a simplifying move. Currently, we take that formula share and we apply new funds using that formula share to determine what each institution would receive. And so this would be Bill, would you be able to explain that slightly better than I can at this moment?
I think I can, Sean. When you get to table 3 in the funding model, to the far right-hand side of that particular spreadsheet tab, there is a column highlighted in blue. It's called formula totals. And what that formula total column is doing, it's saying if you purely distributed the allocable resources that are run through the funding model according to the model metrics and the productivity at each institution relative to each of those metrics, how would that funding be distributed? In other words, that the percentages based on the formula total column assume that you would be distributing the funds as if the institutions are at complete parity. Table 5 in the funding model looks at, does an institution have any hold harmless funds? Are there any historical disparities that need to be addressed, or has productivity at one institution changed relative to productivity in another institution, creating new funding disparities? And so when you get to table 5 is distributing a portion of the funds to address those disparities, and then it's distributing the remainder of the funds using that formula share. And what Jackie Dudley at Murray is saying is, why don't we just stop at table 3 and distribute the funds using that formula share? You're using the funding model to determine, those share percentages, and then every institution would receive, their share of funding, irregardless of any hold harmless amounts or funding disparities. So that's what she's proposing.
Murray State also proposes increasing the weight of non-resident credit hours earned from 0.5 to 1. And so that would treat non-resident credit hours the same as resident credit hours for the funding model purposes. Also asked for dual credit and high school credit hours to count in the model. Currently, they are not a part of the performance funding model. And Murray State pointed out that a 3 model approach would have a similar impact on smaller institutions as the current model. Next slide, Bill. Northern asked for consideration of a 3 model. Again, research institutions, comprehensive institutions, and KCTCS each having their own models. Asked that base funding increases should factor in large increases in utilities costs and wage increases in the marketplace. Asked this group to consider removing mandated programs and the small school adjustment from the model. Finally, asked to expand the degree metric to include all degrees and credentials for the university sector. Currently, only bachelor's degrees are counted in the model. And finally, Western Kentucky University said that a comprehensive reevaluation was needed and a redesign of the model, not minor tweaks. But in lieu of that, a separate model is needed for research institutions. So in other words, 3 models, and asked that credit hours earned by non-resident students be the same as those earned by resident students. So eliminating that distinction, and then finally including all degrees and credentials in the model, not just bachelor's degrees.
So that concludes that section regarding the funding model survey. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we move on to funding model scenarios?
David, I don't know if you were asking this or not. Did you want Bill to give you the definition from at least this viewpoint of what parity was?
Is it weighted or unweighted, Bill?
Well, the model is what determines funding parity, based on productivity at each institution, and there are a number of weights included in that determination of parity.
So I guess what I was getting at, Aaron, is before we can, the notion that we have a weighting between the schools that participate in this flat sector, I think that there's ample evidence here to have a discussion around whether there's weighting or whether we all belong in the same sector. So before we say that that there's parity, I think we've got to acknowledge those weightings. So
I understand. Yeah.
And I know you were at EKU, Dave, President McFadden, when the funding model was developed. But as you may recall, and several people have, indicated that they feel like the sector weighting disadvantages them in some way. And we're going to dig into that in great detail. I had intended to do that at this meeting, but we had so much material to cover, I felt it would be best addressed at the next meeting. But just to remind all of those who were part of that original working group, very few of you remain, but a number of you are new. The purpose for that weighting was to equalize funding between the research sector and the comprehensive sector in the very first year that the model was implemented. And so that was achieved. There was no shifting of funds from the research sector to the comprehensive sector. There was no shifting of funds from the comprehensive sector to the research sector. That was one of the main reasons for those weightings. There are a number of other reasons in addition to cost differentials between the research campuses and the comprehensive sector. The research campuses produce many more graduate and professional degrees and doctoral degrees than the comprehensive institutions. There are mission differences, and so that weighting was intended to address those mission differences, those cost differences, but to also ensure that both the comprehensive and the research sector were on equal footing in that first year. And then as you move forward, now funding can shift from one sector to another. And I'll show you those shifts at our next meeting. But I would argue that you've got one or two institutions, Northern in particular in the comprehensive sector, Western to a lesser extent, that have actually fared pretty well in the funding model. And then you've got UK in the research sector, to a lesser extent U of L, that have performed fairly well in terms of the research sector. And so that's something that we'll dive into in great detail at the next meeting. But I'm going to go ahead and get through these scenarios quickly.
Bill, I've got a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure thing.
One, I'd be interested, I think it was Eastern I'm interested in what Eastern's question about. I made notes, so I'm trying to find it. That the model should emphasize the rate of improvement over volume. And the reason I asked this question is because you just described for us the declining enrollment. Therefore, we've seen declines in certain other, nominal outcomes, and we're going to continue to see those, until enrollment rises. So I wonder if somebody could be brief to explain, why that would be an improvement.
I can explain the difference. I'll let somebody else explain whether they think that's an improvement or not. And that was something that the original working group decided early on in one of the first several meetings. We had to make a decision, or the working group did rather. Do we want to use a target and goals approach, or do we want to use an outcomes-based funding model? And the decision was made. I want to say it was at least eight out of 9 of the presidents were on board with using an outcomes-based approach. The target and goals approach would look at that rate of improvement, but that necessitates that the council and the institutions on a regular basis would have to come together, set goals for each metric, and then you try to determine, okay, did the institution get 50% of the way there in terms of a given metric, or did they get 75% to their goal on a given metric? And then you reward institutions based on the progress they make toward those goals. The outcomes-based approach did not require the setting of targets and goals, and that was the direction that the vast majority of states were going at that time. It was called outcomes-based funding 2.0. There was performance funding, then there was outcomes-based funding, and then there was outcomes-based funding 2.0. And we had several experts from around the country come in and make presentations, but that was the decision of the group at that time. And that's not saying that we can't say, okay, well, at this particular point in time in Kentucky, let's move away from an outcomes-based approach and go to a target and goals approach.
Well, and I would just add, rate of improvement doesn't have to incorporate targets, right? Rate of improvement can be rate of improvement, right? Year over year change, better than before, right?
Right, but you've got to assign some kind of magnitude.
So while you've already conflated the two, and I understand that that's what the first year does, so I'd like to hear Dr. McFadden kind of give us his view on that.
Okay.
Yeah, Secretary Hicks, I think that in looking at that, and as we've highlighted some of the environmental factors that we're facing, that when we look at bachelor degree production, and Bill is right, I think everybody said 60 by 30, and that's an easy way to evaluate that. But I'll also say that the weighting aspect of the formula came very late in the process, and the process was accelerated due to a number of factors and a number of external implications. But there are institutions here who are getting better year over year, but are not getting any distribution of funds because they're not producing enough volume in the system to be able to overcome the sector average that is being set in the sector. And so I think that some thought being given to the fact that an institution can be improving, and that the notion would be that if you want them to continue to improve, they would need some funds to invest in long-term success, that we would that to have a sustainable higher education system in Kentucky, that would be a logical approach to how we do the work.
No, thanks. That's helpful, right? That's where my mind was going, was that improvement. One other question, Bill, and I'll let you move on. University of Kentucky has their last vote is eliminate productivity adjustments in the bachelor's degree metric that negatively impacts growing enrollment institutions. Wanted to understand that a little better.
We take the number of bachelor's degrees, and it's weighted by an index of degrees produced per 100 FTE. And that index is created by looking at each institution's degrees per 100 FTE relative to the sector average degrees produced per FTE. And that index can either reduce the number of degrees that you produce if you're producing those degrees less efficiently than the average, or it can act as a multiplier and increase the number of degrees that you produced in the model because you produce those degrees very efficiently. And what's happening right now, UK is the fastest growing institution in terms of enrollment, and they're doing very well relative to the others in terms of progressing students, and they're producing more degrees. But those degrees, because their enrollment is growing, are being reduced relative to the others because that index is reducing that rate of growth in their degrees.
Yeah, so the denominator rises when you have enrollment growth, you know, so you have more freshmen, but you don't necessarily produce more degrees until those freshmen advance.
Yeah, until 4 or 5 years down the road. And I would like to just comment on one other thing you said, State Budget Director Hicks. When David was saying that it was the weighting that was causing some institutions to not get funding. The main thing that has caused some institutions to not get funding is a lack of new funding. And so for 5 years out of 6, there was either no new funding, or in 1 year, there was actually a budget cut. And then last year, there was some new funding, but it was a very minimal amount, 17 million. So this current year, 2022-23, is the first year in my mind where the funding model has actually received a sufficient level of funding that a lot of other states, Kentucky was one of very few states that adopted a performance funding model and did not fund it. Most states, use that as an opportunity to provide an infusion of new dollars.
Bill, I think we were the only state.
Yeah, and so that's been one of the major contributors, and that's why several institutions have said, it's new funding and sustained funding that our institutions need. But let me get quickly through this so that we save time for KCTCS. There's 6 scenarios I'm going to go through very quickly. They all use the same set of updated appropriations data and the same assumptions regarding no change in student success metric data or operational support data. In terms of the updated appropriations data, for fiscal year 2023-24, we use the direct appropriation for each institution data out of the enacted budget bill, the debt service appropriation, and the mandated program appropriations for each institution to provide that updated data set. And again, in terms of the assumptions, we're assuming no change in student success metric data and no change in operational support metric data. And as we go through through each of these scenarios, the differences in the model application will be noted. So this is sort of the baseline case. This is scenario number 1. And this assumes that you're distributing 100% of available funds using the existing model with no changes. And this is, I'm going to call your attention to that scenario framework over to the right. Every scenario is comparing the baseline actual 2022-23 distribution to a hypothetical 2023-24 distribution. And that is actually a very useful comparison because the allocable resources run through the model and the appropriation to the performance fund are identical in both cases. So what you're going to be looking at with each scenario is only the impact of those proposed changes for that scenario without any other influences. So if you didn't change anything And the student success outcomes were the same. The operational support metrics did not change for this coming year. And the university share of that 97.3 million in the performance fund is 75.8 million. So if there were no changes in performance, the 75.8 million in the coming year would be distributed in exactly the same manner that it was in the current year. This was one of Murray State, I believe, Murray State University's suggestions to distribute the funding at 100% of the formula share. Again, that first column of numbers, you see the baseline 2022-23 distribution. Those three columns in the middle, we're calculating the formula share percentage for 2023-24, based on the assumptions given at the start of this section. And that's highlighted in blue. And then you do a percent of total to get the formula share percentage. You apply that percentage for each institution to the 75.8 million. And then you can see the dollar difference. UK would receive about $5.7 million less using that approach. U of L about $843,000 less. Northern would just receive a little over $4 million less. And then the other institutions would receive more. And the methodology section over to the right explains how this was done, but I'm gonna call your attention to that last bullet. And this is something Sean asked me to explain earlier. The formula totals generated by the model basically represent how allocable resources would be assigned if you were at absolute funding parity. And that means there would be no hold harmless allocation, and every institution is receiving the amount of funding based on what the model says that they should receive. And so that's part of what I've been saying. If you are at that funding parity level, if you look at the hypothetical 2023-24 distribution, every institution receives funding. KSU would receive $915,000 instead of zero. Moorhead would receive 3.8 million instead of zero in the current year. And that's what I'm saying. The problem all along has been that we've never had the model funded until this most recent year. This is distributing the same amount, 75.8 million, but using a third distribution based on formula share, and 66.7% distributed based on the existing model. Again, those three columns to the right of the baseline are calculating that formula share and distributing 25.3 million using the formula share. The remaining 50.5 million is distributed using the existing model. And then in the second column from the right, you've got the hypothetical 23-24 distribution. And you can see those dollar differences in that dollar difference column. And as you can see that under this approach, it would increase the distribution for KSU and Moorhead, and it would reduce the distribution for every other institution. This is an approach that we call targeted increases in small school adjustment. And Secretary Hicks or Budget Director Hicks, you may remember this from 3 years ago. This was something that President Thompson and CPE recommended as a potential change to the funding model 3 years ago. And that was to take the hold harmless allocation from a previous year, in this case, shown in purple, we're taking the hold harmless allocation from 2021-22. And KSU had a hold harmless of about 7.3 million, Moorhead about 2.9 million, Murray about 733,000. If you add those hold harmless allocations to the small school adjustment, as shown highlighted in orange for those three institutions, you can see the impact that would have. And this is just another way within the model to bring those institutions to quote funding parity. Everything that, every one of these scenarios is trying to do is to address that whole funding parity issue. But as you can see, the increases for KSU, Moorhead, and Murray are under this scenario, and then you can see the decreases for every other institution under this scenario.
Bill, I want to say something here. I'm going to show my hand. and I apologize, but you know me. This is one of the things that we, in my opinion, we should have done a while back. As much as, you know, I love KSU and Ron, just because of the size and the population, if we wait to do this until we get to the KSU appropriations per student, we're going to be waiting a whole long time, folks. So Moorhead is almost there, right there. So the idea that, in my mind, we shouldn't go ahead and just go ahead and claim it, John, for a better phrase. I'm sure there's folks like you are smarter than I am in the budget area can come up with better words. I think we are, artificially not moving to really what I call a performance-based full system. So I wanted to throw that out there. No need to respond if you don't want to, but I do think it's time for us to at least consider this after so many years of implementing performance funding.
And President Thompson, I'll remind this group, and of course, some of the folks are new and may not know this, but you were the interim president at KSU, and you knew at the time, and you argued for a 20 to 25% small school adjustment for KSU. President King and CPE staff supported a higher small school adjustment for KSU, but ultimately the working group, and that's what we've got to rely on, is the consensus of the working group decided to go with a 10% small school adjustment instead of a 20%. And that would have doubled KSU's small school adjustment, and it would have immediately got them up to the starting line with the other institutions to kick off the funding model. This scenario looks at taking earned funds in the current year, 2022-23, adding those to the formula base, and the formula base for 2022-23 is shown in pink. And so if you look at those three columns in the middle, we're taking the distribution in the center column, adding it to the adjusted net general fund in the pink column to come up with a hypothetical 2023-24 adjusted net general fund. When you run the model, and then the other assumption is that the performance fund is refilled with $97.3 million. So now when you run the performance funding model and look at that hypothetical 2023-24 column, it is very similar to that scenario number 2, which is distributing 100% of the funding based on formula share. And so basically what it's saying is, when you made those funds recurring, you're now right at funding parity. And I should point out that UK is not losing 5.3 million, U of L is not losing 577,000, Northern's not losing 3.9 million, because if you look in the center column again, the 30.9 million that UK earned in the current year becomes part of their base. The 17.5 million that U of L earned would become part of their base. The 11 million, 11.4 that Northern earned would be part of their base. So that's just getting the funds to be recurring. And now if you ran the model again with the same level of performance funding dollars at 97.3 million, you're essentially at funding parity and very close to that scenario number 2. This was a late addition that was requested by Moorhead State University. Several institutions have requested a base increase outside the funding model. They suggested using a 5% across the board base increase and then running the remainder of the funding through the existing model. And so what we've done here in the pink column is we've taken the 2023 calculated adjusted net general fund. We've applied a 5% across the board inflation adjustment. In that next column, you can see the across the board allocation, and it totals about 29.2 million. If you run the remaining 46.6 million through the funding model in the normal way, that produces a hypothetical fiscal 2023-24 distribution. And there you can see the dollar differences. KSU and Moorhead would receive an increase in their distribution relative to what they received in the current year. Every other institution would see a reduction in their distribution. So that's the end of what we wanted to cover in terms of our slides. I'd like to take a few minutes before we turn it over to the folks at KCTCS to invite any of the campus presidents, State Budget Director Hicks, President Thompson, to make any comments. If you have any questions, we'll be happy to try to answer those. But let's take about at least 5 or 10 minutes and have some discussion.
And we also have Representative Tipton on the line, or I saw him earlier. I don't see him now. Senator Gibbons is in caucus, so he couldn't get here, by the way.
Dr. Payne or Dr. Thompson, can I jump in here real quick?
Sure.
Dr. Payne, I think at our last meeting in person in your offices, we talked about potentially looking at the weights across the board. And I think we said at some point in time, we might run a scenario around what it would look like if we took all the weights to a 1.0. I don't know if we got that far today, but is that something we can put on the table for a future meeting?
We absolutely can, President Morgan, and we're going to be running scenarios between now and our next meeting 6 weeks from now, based on every suggested change that you saw in those 7 slides that Sean went through. You know, some folks have said, oh, well, you need to remove the mandated programs funding, you know, or allow that to be part of the allocable resources run through the funding model. You know, I personally philosophically disagree with that because those are restricted funds. They're line item in the budget bill, and any institution and KSU and UK receive proportionately more mandated program funds than other institutions, but those funds have to be spent for the purposes that were identified in the budget bill, and so they can't be used to educate students. But we're going to run a scenario to show what that looks like, and we'll do so on every suggested change that is included in those 7 slides that we covered today.
Thank you.
I would just also add on that in terms of mandated funds, especially land grant, much of that money never hits the campus. Right? It goes out to extension services, it goes all over the place. And then with land grant, unlike USDA and other, there's basically no overhead. So we wind up effectively subsidizing, and not actually, so that money doesn't actually cover the cost of the delivered service. So you wouldn't want to include that because it just much of that money goes out, and then on top of that, there's no overhead. So therefore, the university is actually not only paying for not only using overhead for instructional costs, but also overhead for in support of those other mandated services.
Yeah, and we will run a scenario for everything. You know, obviously, I'll throw mine in here. I agree with you, Ron. As someone who's had a chance to work with that, those are very lined item items that usually cost you some money in the end to implement them. Cost some of the dollars you're earning from performance funding to implement them. So I would argue that probably isn't going to get you the return on investment that some of you want if you did that. But once again, we'll run everything.
I guess I would weigh into that space just a little bit, is that I'm not sure, and Bill makes a point about the restricted nature of those funds. I'm not sure if those funds, there's a mission that has been explicitly directed for those funds, and I'm not sure how losing those funds how you could fulfill the mission that has been laid out there. So I know that was a recommendation, but I'm just not sure how you put mandated funds into this formula. Now, I do think that the small school adjustment and who participates and who gets how much, I think that that's totally within the control of this group. So.
Other questions for Bill on this issue before we jump in to KCTCS? or any statements you want to make. Bill, you bring KCTCS on?
Alicia, Brendan, are you on the call?
Hi, Bill. Yes, I'm here.
Okay, take it away, Brendan and Alicia.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll get us started and then my name is Brendan Lehane. I'm the Director of Budget and Financial Planning at KCTCS. Our model here is very similar to the university model. We have some different student outcomes and metrics that we use, but we face some of the same challenges. We balancing parity and allowing our colleges to earn performance funding, and we run into those same issues of trying to get all our colleges to an avenue to earn additional funding year to year. I'll get started, and then Alicia Crouch, our Vice Chancellor for Organizational Research and Policy Analysis, will take us through some of the student outcomes and talk us through that. If we can go to the next slide. We'll start off with the trends in student outcomes. Alicia will go through the credentials and transfers, student progression, course completion. Again, that follows the university model in a lot of ways. We have a few more metrics than the university model. We've put a lot of metrics in there. We have some additional credentials that we recognize, workforce, and a little bit different weights. And then we'll go through a funding model review. We did a similar survey with our college presidents and chief business officers on how the model is functioning and some recommendations. I'll go ahead and hand it off to Alicia, and she can run us through some of the student outcomes.
Thank you, Brendan. So I am going to replicate what Dr. Payne showed earlier today. So really go through what our metrics are, how they differ from the four-year model, and what's happened on some of those metrics. So starting with, our model shares a lot of similarities with the four-year model right now. There's a lot of overlap between the metrics. There's some definitional changes or some definitional differences between the two models. For example, KCTCS's model right now is based on a one-year time trend instead of a three-year average for 90% of the metrics. But the metrics themselves are pretty similar to the 4 years. As Brendan mentioned, we do have 4 additional metrics that are not in the four-year model. So I'm going to highlight those here. That is that underprepared students. One of the 3 prongs of the KCTCS mission is to prepare the Kentuckians to be college and career ready. So we do have a lot of students who come to us not quite ready in math, reading, or English. So we do have a bonus or we do have points in the model for those underprepared students. In addition, as Brendan mentioned, we do have several metrics that are tied to the economy, including a high wage, high demand metric, and a metric looking at the number of credentials that we award in the state's identified targeted industry sectors. Again, within our mission, we do also focus on transfer education. So we do have a metric that is focused on transfers. In addition to these 4 additional metrics, we do not have one metric that you heard discussed on the four-year model, and that's that efficiency piece, the number of degrees divided by the FTE for the 4 years. So moving into each of these metrics, and I won't go through them all, we have a very similar presentation to what you saw from the 4 years. We have a table on each of the metrics that looks at where were we in 15-16 before the implementation of the performance-based funding model, and where were we in 2021, the latest fully vetted year. What is that percent change that we see at each of our 16 colleges, as well as the total for the system, number change, the percent change, and then again, as Dr. Payne mentioned, what is that averaged annual growth rate? At the bottom of the slide, you will see for the system as a whole, what is that time trend over the period from 15-16 through 2021. So for KCTCS, you will see that our number of credentials has increased by nearly 30% since the advent of performance-based funding. We did see a big focus on the awarding of credentials due to their inclusion in the model. So while we did not see a decrease in 2021, you will, as we publish the 21-22 numbers, you will see a decrease in these numbers, and that is due to the impacts of COVID on our enrollment. So in addition, we also have the cumulative net gain charts on each of these metrics. So you will see that for the most part, almost all of our colleges have experienced a large cumulative net gain across the period. So for KCTCS, the total cumulative net gain in credentials awarded was 32,000. So really helping the state move forward in credential production. So as we go into, we have 6 metrics, credential metrics that are for subsets. So we have 3 that focus on students who have been traditionally underserved, that is our underrepresented students, our low-income students, and our underprepared students. And then we have 3 metrics that are really tied to the economy. That's STEM plus H, the high wage, high demand, and the targeted industry sector. What I really want to focus on here is that these additional percentages that are focused on subsets of the credentials are really working. So 5 of the 6 subsets that we've chosen to focus on as a state for KCTCS have growth that is above that total average for total credentials. So for our total credentials, you saw they were up about 28%. For the underrepresented minority credentials, we've had an increase of 46% over this period. So, and that includes at cumulative net gains at 15 of our 16 colleges. So the one that we haven't seen as big a growth as our overall credentials is that low income credentials piece. So it is up 16%. And we do have, there was a additional impact of COVID on low income credentials. We saw the most loss in enrollment of students who are low income. And that is in fact affecting these numbers. So again, our underprepared credentials have increased by nearly 50%. So these are credentials awarded to students who came into college not prepared for college level reading, writing, and math. STEM plus H, we've seen an increase of 31%, so just a little bit above those total credentials. We've seen a really big increase in the credentials that are focused on high wage, high demand careers, up about 76% since the start of the model. And our targeted industry sectors are up about 40%. So shifting a little bit to transfers, our transfers are up about 15%. Again, we see some widespread growth across our colleges. 13 of our colleges have increased the transfer numbers in comparing the 2021 to the 2015-16 data. So here's where we start to see a little bit of a decrease. This is due to COVID. So we saw an enrollment decrease of over 10% in the 2021 academic year after the beginning of COVID. So you will see that as we go through the rest of the metrics. So with the progression metrics, you can see through 2019-20, we had a little bit of growth, but remained pretty steady before dropping quite significantly in that 2021 academic year. We will continue to see those smaller numbers into the 21-2022, but we have started rebounding in that our current 22-23 academic year. Our enrollment right now is up 7.8% in spring compared to last year this time. So again, students reaching 30 credit hours is down about 6.5% across the system. So pretty level numbers here with a drop due to COVID. 45 plus credit hours, you'll see the same thing. Pretty steady trend here with a drop at the end due to COVID. And same thing in the weighted course completion realm. So we were seeing a pretty steady increase, small but steady increase in the weighted course completions through 2019-20 with the drop due to COVID in 2021. So turning it over to Brendan.
Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, and we'll take you through some of the responses we got to our survey and some of the recommendations and unintended consequences we had when we sent the survey out to the college business officers and college presidents. Funding model review. We did see that the goals of the model align with the mission, vision, and strategy of outcomes for outcomes of KCTCS. They follow the strategic vision of KCTCS. KCTCS has implemented new and additional student success strategies to strengthen retention and completion rates. We can see that's through some of the stuff that Alicia took us through. They've colleges invested in retention completion. The credentials seem to be up across the board since the implementation of the model. Again, feedback is performance funding works best when fully funded with new dollars. When initially implemented, it was reallocated dollars, and it didn't work as well in the early years of the model. Unintended consequences. The current model rewards colleges that serve communities with larger populations and more robust economies. Little recognition to service or local community needs. It is a very volume-based model. It is harder for the smaller colleges to earn some of those performance funding dollars. Current model favors course completion and higher credit hour levels and lacks recognition of shorter go-to-work credentials. We do have weights for the higher credit hour credentials, associate's degrees, and smaller weights for those short-term certificates and go-to-work credentials. Performance funding cannot be used for recurring needs. And this is a big one with the university model for recurring needs or program development, as they are not allocated to colleges based on a recurring basis. We talked a little bit that Bill talked about a little bit that with the universities, colleges are hesitant to invest performance funding as it's not recurring. It can go away the next year. So on to the next slide. There's no metric supporting re-engagement of adult learners. That adult learner population has been a big focus for KCTCS colleges. There's a suggestion of having a metric in there for adult learners. We do have some overlap in our STEM plus H targeted industry and high wage, high demand credentials. Inadequate recognition of the value of transfer students. We do have a transfer metric in there. It's been suggested that it be a bigger part of the model. And the same with URM, underprepared and low income student success. Some of the recommended adjustments that came out of the survey were to use a 3-year average on all metrics except for square footage to smooth economic and population change impacts. We use 1 3-year average, I believe, on our current model. It just 3-year average would take some of the volatility from year to year. If we move towards earning the earned funding becoming part of a base, it would also smooth that volatility from year to year. Allowed earned funds to become part of an institution's base. That was again brought up as a recommended adjustment on making those dollars recurring. Promote equity by accounting for regional differences. It is a volume-based model. It was suggested that we modify the equity adjustment based on community needs index, which is a metric that considers local unemployment, labor force participation, and poverty rates. Additional recommendation was to reduce the weighting of the progression metrics from 12 to 7% to reflect the shorter time retention of KCTS students as they complete short-term credentials. This would allow us to add in adult metrics and some of the other things that were suggested. Merge the STEM plus H, high wage, high demand, and targeted industry credentials within overall credential calculation. As we talked about before, those are some that have some overlaps. And reduce the weighting of the credential metric from 15 to 18% in an effort to allow increased focus on URM, underprepared, low income, and transfer students. Add a metric for adult learners. There's currently not anything in our current model for adult education, and possibly add an additional metric that compares the college's current year performance to its previous year performance. This would be allowed to incentivize all our colleges and allow colleges to potentially receive performance funding distribution. Again, that goes back to us trying to allow all our colleges to earn some performance funding prior to prior to parity, I guess. And, it, again, if we can, it's that balancing of parity versus incentivizing all our colleges to perform and be able to get a piece of the pie. We can take any questions if we have anything on the KCTCS model.
I don't have a question, but I really like the way you laid that out. Also, I appreciate the very way that you focused on your missions and how you guys can use the model to do what it needs to be done, especially as you serve low-income, first-generation adult learners and so on. So I just wanted to compliment you on what I thought was an excellent presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson.
Any questions for KCTCS?
Yeah, this is Dr. Thompson, John Hicks. I've got a question. And this is a data question. In the high wage, high demand metric, is there a frequency or a data change? At what point, something can become high wage 5 years, or later after something as well as high demand. So what's the frequency of changing the data defining high wage, high demand?
So right now we are updating it annually. I think that is a little too frequent. So we are using the annual wages file from KY Stats, as well as their biannual occupational outlook to update the metric. We would like to propose as we move forward that maybe we shift to reviewing it every 3 years so that there is some consistency at the colleges in putting programs in place.
Secretary Hicks, I think you've asked another question too along those lines. If you put something in a model, you're going to have to make sure that it's defined in such a manner that it's not fluctuating so often, right? I mean, as far as that variable goes or that metric goes. The other item too, I think it's important as we look at Kentucky and Kentucky's growth, just with our economic development growth, it's really has caused certain high demand jobs to be in place that we didn't look at 3 years ago, right? So a part of the fluidity of this, I think, would have to be worked out in how you do that in a manner around a performance funding model. But I do like the idea. 3 years is really anymore as fast as our economy is moving. It should not be 5 years for sure. It needs to be looked at over a shorter period of time. But I'm probably putting words in your mouth, Secretary Hicks. If I am, I apologize, but that's what I kind of heard you were saying.
Well, and in the context that I asked the question, Alicia really touched on it, which is, things are moving quickly, but yet we're talking about, post-secondary ed training and education here, right? So you're building to something or you're expanding to something, right? You got to give yourself lag time, to meet it. So thanks for the answer.
Now, one quick question on the 4-year, there was a recommendation in terms of dual credit. I didn't see anything referenced, but I do know that KCTCS also does dual credit. So is that something that you would actually consider?
So we actually include our dual credit students throughout the model. So we include them in all metrics right now.
KCTCS doesn't do this the way the 4-year institutions do it, but I think as we go down the road, let's not, and Bill showed this in his data, but I think there's some real discussion that needs to happen about what are those metrics. Obviously, it's no longer serving that we could divide to serve this fast-moving economy that we're trying to serve, right? Whether it's an adult learner, which you all know that I'm pushing, or whether or not it's the low income, where we haven't done nearly as, we haven't moved it as much, underrepresented, where we could, that's the growing population in the state. I mean, there's all kinds of things that I think we need to discuss as we go along. Dual credit is a good example. KCTC, all of us are in that business. But, I know you all have incorporated that in your model, but I would even ask you to look at it deeply with, I know we've been able to get a little more money than we had before, but my guess is this is going to grow even more. So I would ask you, Alicia and Brenda, to really take a look at it too and see if it really is where it needs to be as y'all think about this.
President Thompson, I'd like to add some additional context. President McFadden brought up an issue about how do we define parity, and I think we need to, between now and next meeting, really take a close look at that and dive into some detail and come back prepared to respond to that question in a broader way. But I do want to share some information. And you asked about this as well, State Budget Director Hicks, about how do you define funding parity. And what I'm sharing right now is a slide that we shared at the first working group meeting. It's looking at state funds for educating students per full-time equivalent student. And we've now added 1 year of updated data. The slide that we shared 6 weeks ago was through 2021-22. We didn't have fall 2022 final FTE enrollment at that time. And about 2 weeks ago, we had final fall FTE enrollment for 2022. And so we were able to update this chart. But what it's showing in terms of the blue bar is 2016-17, the state funds for educating student per FTE for 2016-17. And now you can see the state funds for educating students for fiscal year 2022-23. And if you just focus in on the comprehensive institutions, excluding KSU, and Northern Kentucky University back in 16-17 was funded at $3,887 per student. Morehead, the highest, excluding KSU, $5,240. That's a little over a $1,300.50 difference. And now if you look at the difference between Morehead and Northern Kentucky University, you're down to about $350. And so this is one thing that the funding model was designed to achieve, not necessarily funding parity per FTE, but funding parity as defined by the model. And it just so happens that the model gets very close in terms of funding parity in terms of the funding on a per FTE basis. And as you know, this is something prior to 2003-04, when we went with a benchmark funding model, Kentucky for about 2 decades used an enrollment-driven formula to fund the higher education institutions, and a number of our legislators and others, a number of people at higher ed boards like the council, when they go to make state-to-state comparisons or interstate comparisons, look at funding per FTE. And what this additional funding, the $97.3 million in 2022-23 has done is it really has brought those comprehensive institutions to virtual parity in terms of the funding per FTE, and they are at parity in terms of the funding model, except for KSU. And so that would be one way that you could define funding parity is what does your state funding per student look like across institutions? And this gives you some sense of that.
And Bill, I do appreciate that. And I think that in the comprehensive sector, you're right. There was a round of funding. They did about half the parity in a direct appropriation, and then the model has moved that sector as well. But since all the 4 years are in the same sector, I think that how that idea of parity, if all 4 years are together, I think is kind of a further conversation.
And I agree wholeheartedly with that, President McFadden. I can't wait to get into that discussion at our next meeting.
Any more questions for Bill on this? Bill, what do we have left to go over? We have some,
Well, Yeah, just to talk about next steps, and we had given some thought to sharing this, at today's meeting. About 4 or 5 weeks ago, we sent out a template that had every proposed change to the funding model listed. We asked, each university, to indicate whether they would be in agreement or disagreement with that particular proposed change. On most of those proposed changes, we only got about half of the institutions responding, because some of them said, well, we don't know what that proposed change really means, or we understand what that proposed change means, but we don't understand how that would impact our institution. Now, some of the proposed changes, like, hey, we need to increase the weighting for URM students, and we need to increase the weighting for low-income students. The majority of institutions jumped in and said, hey, we support that. But on some of the other proposed changes, only about 3 or 4 institutions responded, and the rest were saying, well, we need more information before we can say whether we're going to support that or not. So what we're going to do is run some of those additional scenarios so that we can show the campuses what does each proposed change mean for your institution in terms of the financial impact. We're going to give them another shot to respond to that survey so that we get a broader set of responses. And we're going to bring that back at our next meeting. Obviously, if any institution wants to send me or Sean an email and ask us to run additional scenarios that are not related to any of the proposed changes that are already on the table, please send me an email to that effect. Otherwise, what we're going to do at our next meeting is take a look at that template, see if there are any of these proposed changes that there may already be some consensus building around those proposed changes. And we're going to start tackling those one by one over the next, 3 to 4 months. I don't think we can address every proposed change in one meeting, but over the next couple of meetings, we want to go through item by item on every proposed change, look at what the financial impact is on the campuses, see which institutions support it and which ones do not support it, and then allow the working group to discuss and see if they can reach some kind of consensus about whether they want to make a change or not on any of those proposed items.
Hey, Aaron and Bill, I guess this is just a question for the group. There were a few recommendations to add new metrics entirely, which would be a pretty big fundamental change to, kind of running the model with this agreed upon set. And we could change weightings and we can change those distributions, but adding additional metrics, Bill, do we need to start? I don't know where to add that, because if you add them at the end, it gets really complicated. And are there focuses that we need to be focused, whether it's adult learners or whether it's, whoever, whatever the case might be, I don't know.
Well, it's interesting. The one thing, Bill, I'll let you jump in after this. The only one thing that everybody agreed on was the URN. That was the one item that every institution agreed on, which I thought was very telling, right? But that can be adjusted within the model, right? The new one, the one that I can tell you CPE is going to be asking for, and originally I was going to strongly push 2. One would have been a quality metric of some sort, workforce, but I don't know how we can get there in this short amount of time to define that. The other was going to be some adult learner metric, which several of you did bring up, KCTCS especially. So those were the only, and I believe that we need to take some, and this has come from several legislators, by the way, take a look at the square footage metric, because, are we expanding our physical space, or are we expanding our virtual space to serve students? That's been asked of me to answer. But, there's several things you can do to move things around in the model. So the other question then is how we look at that if we add a new one or expand on some of our current ones. The other I would ask us to look seriously at would be the low income metric to maybe take away from one piece of the model to give to that. So those are the things I can tell you, President McFadden, that I'm going to be bringing to the table for us to take a look at in earnest.
And one other thing, Bill, that I did not see that made it into any of these, and I don't, I mean, maybe we've all got to deal with our own issues, but from KCTCS to all the regionals on here, you know, this pension issue, the pension escalator over the next several years will be a fixed and unavoidable cost that's going to linger with us for 25 years. I don't know how to, I don't know whether we can address that. I understand that the non-pension participating institutions have to control their benefits and those types of things, but we don't really have any choice. We are, it is a mandated, it's a mandated program we've been put into. And I guess, I know we talked about pensions early on and performance funding never really come to a resolution. The new funds, the funds that are running through to help support that are being treated as mandated funds that are not in the model. But I just think that's another topic that may rear its head in this discussion. So.
I agree, President McFadden, and thank you for bringing that issue up. And that's something that President Thompson and the CPE executive leadership considered as part of the tuition setting process. I'm sure y'all discussed that during the president's meeting, and we don't need to talk about it in this particular meeting. I also thank you for bringing up the idea of adding additional metrics to the model and how that might impact things, because when you add those additional metrics, as President Thompson said, you're going to have to carve some weighting out of some other metric or eliminate some other metric in order to add the new metric. He mentioned the low income student metric. The weighting for that low income student metric and the dollars assigned to that pool is at the lowest level of any of the degree premiums in the public university model. STEM plus H has a higher premium than the low income degree metric. URM has a much higher weighting or a dollar amount assigned to that pool on a per degree basis than the low income. And so, as you may recall, President McFadden, I know President Thompson does, that was a recommendation CPE staff made 3 years ago, is that we wanted to raise the amount of dollars going to that low income student metric, because at that time, 3 years ago, we realized that we weren't making the kind of progress in awarding degrees to low income students that we were in awarding degrees for STEM plus H disciplines or for underrepresented minority students. Several institutions have mentioned that they feel like we might want to add an adult learner metric. I know that President Thompson and CPE executive leadership is very interested in an adult learner metric. I've actually consulted with Travis Muncie, our executive director of data and advanced analytics, to find out if we can make that a weighting within the earned credit hour component, because that would allow us to give significant weight to adult learners in terms of those earned credit hours without necessarily carving those percentages out of some other metric. And we do have the data that would support that. And so we're going to be looking at that. But that is an issue, is anytime you're going to add a metric, where are the dollars going to come from? And as you know, that earned credit hour component is 35%. That's the single biggest funding pool. And so there might be some logic to saying, hey, let's identify earned credit hours for students above a certain age, and let's put a hefty weighting in that earned credit hour metric, because that's a very large pool. If we don't get more adult learners back into the system and get them to a credential or a degree, we're not going to hit our 60 by 30 goal. So anyway, thank you for bringing up the.
Well, and I want to be clear from my vantage point, David, I am looking at what's good for us to get to that 60 by 30. So that's my motivation, to be honest with you. I look at the 30 credit hour. I mean, that's heavily enrollment driven, right? I mean, from the front end, you're going to have to really build that. I mean, our data really, if you look at this closely, I know you all have, believe me, I know you all. I mean, it's really pointing to what is working and what probably isn't working or no longer needs to work. And I would hope that whatever we do, we look at that in earnest once again and put the things in that works to get us to the 20 by 30. And so I hope we're able to have that conversation in really deep detail.
And I'll park this here. I don't know what to do with this, but I know Tim and what they do at Western with autism, and they've done and there's good things going on every campus for the deaf and hard of hearing community. We are the institution that serves that community, and I think for those who have defined DOE accommodations, I don't know what we do, but if we're going to broaden the pipeline, and if we just look at our K-12 partners and see the number of accommodations and 504 plans and students who are being diagnosed who need some kind of true support, I don't know how we make sure that perhaps there is some funds available to support students on our campuses that need those additional services. Just a thought. I don't know how we do it, but the Office of Vocational Rehab, a lot of other folks have pulled out of supporting a lot of those students with those needs. And I think that's something we have to contemplate in this process. And
I've been approached by that. We're even looking at our diversity policy to start including that to show that that is an important item to the state. So there's a lot of ways we need to think about triangulating this, how we look at the strategic agendas and plans that each campus have, performance funding model, the policies that are out there, how we use tuition to do a variety of things, and look at the performance funding model to kind of get us where we need to go. Other questions, statements?
President Thompson, I'm going to throw one more thing out there. Sean and I have gone through those summary statements from those performance funding surveys in some detail, and in trying to distill that down into, 8 or 10 slides is very difficult. And so I would encourage work group members, we're going to post those out there at a link that you can access. I would encourage folks to go out there and read each institution's individual summary statements. But one sort of consistent theme, and President Thompson, you and I have had several discussions about this, as you know, is that several institutions, several to me would indicate 3, actually more than several institutions have indicated that they're very interested in things that might not necessarily be within the funding model, like some kind of an inflationary adjustment to the base for institutions that would be outside the funding model. And given that this is a biennial budget cycle that we're kicking off here this spring, and we're going to be making a recommendation by November 1st of the council's biennial budget recommendation, those are some things that we need to talk about as part of this working group as well, because if we're talking about, tens of millions of dollars potentially in a funding request to address some inflationary increase items at each institution. And as you know, in 2022, the Higher Education Price Index put out by the Common Fund Institute hit 5.2%. That's the highest that it's been in 2 decades. And I suspect it's going to be even higher when the 2023 number comes out. And so all of our institutions are getting hit with a lot of those fixed and unavoidable cost increases. And that might be something that's better addressed outside the funding model, but in tandem with our recommendation for operating funds for the campuses.
Yeah, we'll pick that. We can talk about it here. I know this is a fuller group than just the presidents here, but I think it is important. And the presidents and I, Bill, have talked about what does it look like to make sure that we do have things possibly outside the performance funding model and tuition that helps us to build our institution to help build the communities we're in. So that is a conversation that we need to have. Once again, there's other people here other than the presidents and institutions in this process, but I think those folks need to hear this argument also.
Dr. Thompson, just a quick question. I know we have these scheduled out, but I mean, is there a longer work session day or kind of a roll up our sleeves, kind of tinker with things? Because I feel like that maybe and I know for Bill, it's hard to kind of run things on the fly, but I just wonder if at some point in this process, we'll get to a point where we need to kind of get in a room and maybe spend a day together, just kind of doing a work session.
You know what? It's so interesting you brought that up. I was dealing here on my text, not that I was avoiding you all, but I'm doing our business. There is a need for us to have a longer session after the legislative session is over, face to face with our legislators and budget director in the room. If this is where you're going, I think right now we're giving you a lot of information. If you notice, a lot of the information, though, it's really kind of collapsing, and now we're starting to see similar outputs from what everybody are saying. But we need to get to a point where we dissect that, come to a consensus on all of us, not just the institutions. And I think the only way we can do that is to go a deeper dive and a deeper conversation and an honest conversation, and really try to get to some, at least, conclusions. And I've been we have to do it after the session is over so everybody can be available to us. So the answer is yes. Absolutely. I would assume all of you would agree with that, right? Yeah.
President Thompson, one other thing I want to make the group aware of, and they may recall that at our last meeting, one of the next steps for this meeting was intended to do an environmental scan. You know, what are other states doing in terms of their performance funding models? That got removed from the agenda for today's meeting, number one, because we already had a pretty full agenda. But number two, if Sean McKiernan's on the line, I want him to maybe speak to this communities of practice workshop that 4 or 5 of our CPE staff are going to be attending. And it's about making adjustments to performance funding models. And only 13 states, you had to submit proposals and get those accepted, and it's being funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But it's to bring together representatives from higher ed boards from 13 states to talk about best practices and how to make adjustments to performance funding models, which is, you know, exactly what we're in the middle of at this point. Sean, you got anything you want to add in that regard?
We submitted a proposal, and I think because of Kentucky's success with outcomes-based funding, and with where we are in the process that we're undertaking a review, our proposal was accepted to participate in this community of practice workshop on outcomes-based funding, and it will be in April 11th and 12th. So
and it's our data and analytics folks, in addition to some of our finance folks. And we're going to circle back around and hopefully be able at a future meeting to come back and say, what are some of the best practices that we're hearing that other states are undertaking, and share that information with you at a later meeting.
Okay. Anything else? Folks, we're going to let you go early, it looks like. I'm sure you don't mind that. I appreciate the conversation. Tim, Todd, you didn't say anything, but I know you had a lot to say. I read it in your mind. Good to see everyone. And unless you have anything else to bring to this group now, we're going to adjourn. Have a good one, folks.
Thank you.